He's now 93, still going strong, and it's a project to bring the arts into the Tucson public schools, helping young people find other ways to be successful in the schools. Another story, Gary Maxworthy, is somebody who was an idealistic young man. He wanted to go into the Peace Corps in the 1960s. He'd been moved by JFK's call to service to ask what we could do for the country, but he was also practical. He had a family. He couldn't afford to do it, so he went into the food distribution business, spent decades being successful in that area, and then in his late 50s, as he neared his 60th birthday, his wife was diagnosed with cancer and passed away. And he took a look at his life. He took a step back. He questioned what wall his ladder was leaning against. And he decided to go into Vista. He wasn't quite ready to go abroad and join the Peace Corps. This seemed like the next best thing. And Vista, in its great wisdom, sent him to the food bank in San Francisco, where he quickly discovered that food banks throughout the state only gave out canned and processed food. And it was a distribution problem. But he also knew from his earlier work that growers throughout the state were throwing out tons and tons of fresh produce and other good food because it was one way or another blemished. It wasn't considered supermarket or restaurant quality. So again, fusing experience and innovation, Gary created the Farm to Family program, which was essentially solving a distribution problem. Last year, Farm to Family distributed 60 million pounds of produce to food banks throughout California. You know, Gary could have done a wonderful job in the Peace Corps at 22, but he couldn't have done something and anything resembling that scale. Robert Chambers is another example of a Purpose Prize winner. He's from Lebanon, New Hampshire. He wasn't an idealistic young man in the same way. He went off to the Vietnam War, dropped out of college to do that, saw a tremendous amount of disturbing developments in the process of being a soldier, came back, worked in the banking business, moved from his native Alabama to New York, and finally he managed to achieve the freedom from work that he longed for. He's a cyclist, and he wanted to spend the rest of his days bicycling. So near the age of 60, he moved to Lebanon, New Hampshire, quickly discovered, even before the downturn, that he didn't have enough in his 401k, and he was going to need to go back to work. So he got a job, what seemed like a good job, as a used car salesman in Lebanon, New Hampshire. And that worked out fine for a while until he realized that his agency and all the other agencies in the area were making their profits by capitalizing on the lack of sophistication of rural buyers, of woodchucks, as they are known in that part of the country. There'd be training seminars for how to take advantage of woodchucks. And there'd be special bonuses put on cars for the salesman who managed to unload that vehicle on the least sophisticated buyer. And this happened over and over again. One day, a car that had maybe 9 months left on it was sold to a man who was not in the best position to negotiate, who came from a rural hamlet. And as this guy is driving off with the car, maybe has 9 months or a year left on it, smoke belching out of the back, Robert standing at the front door of the agency, watching him lead, and realizing that this is going to be a tragedy. Not only is the car going to die in 9 months or a year, but he's been sold a 5-year, 15% loan, so he's not going to be able to buy a new car when that car dies. And if you don't have a car and you live in a rural area in rural New Hampshire, you can't work. And if you can't work, you can't support your family. And if you can't support your family, a whole set of other unhappy developments quickly follow. And as he's thinking about this and getting increasingly angry, he hears a clapping sound, and he turns around, and the sales manager and the finance manager are high-fiving behind a glass wall. And he realized he could not be part of this any longer. And so he couldn't leave his job either. He needed the money, so he plotted and planned on his bicycle trips. And he's a big fan of car talk, and he came up with the idea for Bonnie Clack, which is a nonprofit that provides fuel-efficient new cars, low-interest loans, credit counseling to rural buyers in northern New England, and has been an enormous success. And in fact, Robert was invited to the White House several months ago by the president, spent some time in the Oval Office, gave a speech in which he uttered a line that continues to resonate for me. He said, "I was old enough to recognize injustice when it was in front of me, and I was experienced enough to do something about it." And I could think of no better benediction for what so many of the Purpose Prize winners and so many other people are doing. And I called Robert afterwards, and I said, "Wow, that must have been the highlight of your year, of your life." He said, "Oh, no, I had something even better happen. It turns out he was interviewed on Car Talk for 20 minutes. He was absolutely aglow. We don't hear a lot about people like Robert Chambers, about Gary Maxworthy, about so many people who are either social innovators in the second half of life or in various ways, whether it's volunteering or paid, who are dedicating themselves to their community. Mostly we hear about that long gray wave of greedy geezers, this terrible prospect of demographic change, which is going to make us a much grayer nation, even though as a country we're relatively young compared to places like South Korea and Japan, Germany, Italy, where over 40% of the population by mid-century will be in their 60s. There are two problems with a lot of these Jeremiads. The first is really a fundamental paradox. How is it that the best thing that's ever happened to us as individuals, Jan talked about the 30 years of life expectancy on average that's grown since the beginning of the last century. How is this personal triumph such a collective calamity? How is it that by eating our vegetables and running around the block and reducing the stress in our lives and doing all the things that are supposed to make us healthier and live longer, we're actually undermining the well-being of future generations and the economy and everything else? And so I can understand how that might be a possibility. It's certainly not an inevitability. And when you look further into a lot of the concerns that you hear today, a fundamental mistake, and I don't in any way want to be a Pollyanna, these demographic changes are enormous and are going to require much creativity and dealing with a lot of fiscal issues. But at the same time, there's an easy coupling of these demographic changes, which are easy to predict. Everybody who's going to turn 60 in 2030 is already alive. We know roughly when these changes are going to happen, with an assumption that this new generation of folks are going to adopt the lifestyle of previous generations. It's a kind of scenario planning through the rearview mirror. But if you look through the rearview mirror, what's so striking is how recent these lifestyle realities are. And in fact, if you go back to northern New England, the area where Robert Chambers worked, the town of Ludlow, Vermont, January 30th, 1940, the first Social Security check was given to a woman named Ina Mayfull, a retired legal secretary and bookkeeper, culmination of a long process, much debate. In 1935, FDR signed the Social Security Act. I'm sure many of you are watching the National Park special, which is focused on the CCC. Roosevelt insisted that we'd have 300,000 young men in the woods. The reason we were doing that is because unemployment among young people was in the mid 20% in the heart of the Depression. We were greatly concerned about social unrest. There had been a Bolshevik revolution in Russia. And so a whole set of efforts were put in place to try to stabilize the lives of young men. And Social Security was passed in part because of the grinding poverty so many older people were facing in the country. It was passed also to create an incentive and an exit strategy for many older people to leave the workforce so that young people could move into those jobs. 65 was picked as the eligibility age based on the Prussian military pension from the 1870s. Otto von Bismarck had enacted 65, convinced the state would never pay a single pension. And I think the young New Dealers may have been convinced of the same thing.